30 years ago, in September 1994, students at the Australian National University in Canberra occupied the Chancellery building for 8 days. They were fighting the imposition of upfront fees for postgraduate courses, and it was probably the first student occupation anywhere in Australia to last that long. It involved hundreds of students in a festival of resistance, and although it didn't win everything, it forced the university into concessions. It also inspired other students around the country to take up the fight against fees. Tom Orsag was working in Canberra at that time and was an active supporter of the occupation, and here he's going to tell us the story of the struggle. You're listening to The Sound of Solidarity, brought to you by Solidarity. We're a revolutionary socialist group in Australia, and if you'd like to find out more about us, our website is solidarity.net.au. I'm David Glanz, and I'm recording this episode on unceded Wurundjeri land in Narm, or Melbourne. So welcome, Tom.
Hello, David.
So tell us, why were the students angry, and what was happening with the higher education system in Australia at that time?
Well, in July 1994, the spark for student anger at the ANU in Canberra and other campuses was that the Vice-Chancellors of the universities, via their lobby group, the Australian Vice-Chancellors Committee, AVCC, had got the Labor government to approve them being able to charge for upfront fees for effectively what were compulsory postgraduate diplomas. The AVCC had lobbied the federal Labor government to let this happen. And at ANU, law students were required to do a one-year course called Legal Workshop. It gave them the right to practice as a lawyer. In mid-1994, the Vice-Chancellor at ANU, Dean Terrell, and his hatchet man, Pro-Vice-Chancellor Philip Self, announced that law students would be charged $9,000 up front for the compulsory legal workshop for the next year. That's $9,000 in 1994 dollars. Now, Terrell chose the law faculty because he saw law students as being more conservative and cashed up cohort of students who would simply roll over and accept the new fees. Boy, did he get the surprise. Once VC Tyrrell had used the law faculty as his thin edge of the wedge policy to establish the principle of charging upfront fees for postgraduate studies, he hoped to apply it to every other faculty. Now, the law students absolutely hated that idea and began to organise protests in the law faculty against the fees. Students from other faculties, postgraduates, and the two socialist clubs on campus joined the law students in these protests, as they all recognised it would be applied to them if Tyrrell won the principle of fees. What was happening in the higher education system was that by 1994, Labor had been in government for 11 years. Hawke and his treasurer Keating had been in the forefront of introducing privatisation and what we now call neoliberalism in almost every aspect of economic life. And in 1986, that's 3 years into the Labor government, the Education Minister, John Dawkins, introduced the beginnings of neoliberal policies into higher education. Gone was free education of the Whitlam era, and Australian capitalism had returned to crisis in the recessions of 74 and 1982. And so the ruling class would make others pay for the crisis of their system. Now, for Dawkins, students would now have to pay for their tertiary education. But he had to introduce the fees with his own particular thin edge of the wedge style, and that was called the Higher Education Administration Charge, HEAC, also known as the tertiary tax. And to get that established, they set it at a reasonably low figure of $250. And he argued, look, it's only $250, it's not full fees, etc., etc. Now, over the years, the HEAC became HEX in 89, and today it's got the Orwellian name of HELP, HELP. Under HELP, students today now pay about $50,000 for an arts degree. By 1986, and prior to Dawkins introducing it, student protests had died down from the halcyon days of the late 60s and early 70s, and the mainstream media crowed about it in those preceding years. So Dawkins and Labor were not particularly worried about student protests over fees. But in 1986, student activism was revived because of Dawkins's minor tax. And as I said, the minor tax morphed into thousands of dollars, even as HECS by 1989. Now, Dawkins's neoliberal agenda was driven by the fact that government and business wanted a growing expansion of higher education and a skilled workforce, but neither of them were going to pay for it. Company tax had dropped from 17% of government revenue in the early 70s to less than 10% by 1988. Under Hawke, the percentage of GDP, that's the national economic earnings, spent on higher education had been cut from 1.13% in 1983 to 0.99% by 1988. So that drop of 0.14% was actually worth millions of dollars. Someone's going to have to take up the slack. Dawkins says, let's get the students to do that. So by 1994, there'd actually been on and off about 8 years of student activism against this sort of neoliberalism. And there's a fantastic book which chronicles the student activism in Australia since the 1960s by a guy called Graham Hastings, and it's titled It Can't Happen Here. It's out of print, but if you can source it from your university or state library, I highly recommend it.
Now, occupations don't come out of nowhere. You've talked about some years of student organising. But specifically, how did the student campaign unfold at ANU that year?
Okay, as I said, the law students began to organise protests in the law faculty. They lobbied their dean to stop the fees. He said he could do nothing. Then they organised a student strike in the law faculty. As our Socialist Student Club leaflet said, I'll read this out to you and give you an impression of what they did. On a half day's notice, 300 students crowded a lecture theatre to decide on action. 2 days later, 450 students demonstrated outside a faculty meeting to demand the fee be immediately scrapped. The following week, a mass meeting voted unanimously for strike action. Students shut down the law faculty for the day. Mass pickets of up to 250 people made sure that not one lecture took place. Messages of support arrived from the students at University of Canberra, who were also fighting the introduction of upfront fees, and from the general staff at ANU. Male drivers and other campus workers respected the students' picket line to the cheers of the students. Groups travelled around the campus building support for the strike, leafleting and megaphoning. By 2 p.m, more than 800 people had gathered at the main picket. From there, they marched to the VC's office, shouting no fees, no surrender, and free education. Now, the Canberra Times on the 5th of August said about 300 students heckled and jeered members of the ANU law faculty during the meeting yesterday. And at ANU, the president of the Students' Association, Caitlin Wyndham, and a more conservative socialist club, the Socialist Alliance, but that was then the biggest left group in Australia, wanted the protest to go off campus, to march into Civic or the more distant Parliament House. And they wanted to take the fight off campus because they didn't see the VC, the admin and the University Council as part of what we would call the ruling class on campus. And that was a very important point that as socialists we had to argue. And we had to back it up with factual evidence. Because VC Tyrrell was happy to portray himself as having a tough job on the meat and the sandwich between the students and the government. And we pointed out that the national VC's lobby group, the Australian Vice-Chancellors Committee, had been actively advocating for upfront fees for all students, lobbying the Labor government. And the University Council reflects the interests of the capitalist class on campus. For example, the ANU Chancellor, Geoffrey Yeend, was also on the board of Alcan, the Canadian mining and aluminium manufacturer, the board of Capital 10 television station, Coca-Cola, and Mercantile Mutual Insurance. The Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Pauline Griffin, had been a manager at Bradmill Textiles, a personnel manager at another company, and a commissioner of the Arbitration Commission, today's equivalent of today's Fair Work Commission. Also appointed to the council by the Governor-General was a guy called Ian Gregg, who was a chief executive of the Federal Chamber of Automotive Industries of Canberra. And you'll find the same pattern of capitalist interests in the makeup of every university council in Australia today. And this was important in socialists getting the argument right about staying on campus, because on offer were the other alternatives, which is, it's more political if we go to Parliament, or, students get radicalised if they're fighting the cops in the streets, as some socialists would argue. Now, inside our own socialist group, there was a minority in favour of this second argument. And after we had a debate, the Socialist Club that we were involved in made two arguments: that this neoliberal extension of the fees for postgraduates was the thin edge of the wedge, and that would be applied to all students, and that we should stay on campus to fight the enemy that's imposing it, that is, the Vice-Chancellor, the administration, and the University Council. And it turned out that the ANU Law Student Society and its president, Lyndon Coppin, had a better grasp of this initially on what to do than some on the left. Law students stayed on campus. There were weeks of lobbying, protests, pickets, and a law students' strike to stop the postgraduate fees. And that was the objective part of getting an occupation happening. The willingness of students to fight the VC and admin for months, and broadening it out not just from law students but to other students and other faculties. Indeed, as the campaign became more and more militant, some of the law students began to peel off. And then there's a subjective part of how you get an occupation happening. And the subjective part is someone who has to actually argue for it, campaign for it, win students to the idea, and then do the political and technical preparations to make this happen. One thing we learned as the campaign went on is what I'd call working your way through reformism. And that means that the process of real struggle means people, whether they're students or workers, need to do a variety of actions to see those actions are limited and aren't always enough to win. So students had to exhaust every reformist option, for example, lobbying the Dean of Law, before they were ready to occupy the Chancellery building where the VC was. And when you're leading hundreds and even 1,000 people, you're no longer convincing individuals by one-to-one conversations, although those conversations are still part of it. You now have to and are able to demonstrate the power and the dynamic of mass struggle. So where you lead it, how you lead that energy is incredibly important. And in the early days of August, while working through student reformism, exhausting every reformist occupation before escalating to an occupation, some of our Socialist Club members argued we should be arguing for an occupation from the outset. And again, we had another debate in our club which concluded that we could put something like a phrase calling for a future unspecified occupation in our leaflet, but the campaign wasn't ready for the idea of an occupation as an immediate agitational demand. Now, the more the campaign was built and the more the other side, that is Tyrrell and his henchman self, the more they made mistakes, the more we could argue for a case for occupation and really make it happen. And Tyrrell made the mistake of cancelling the early August University Council meeting, which was going to discuss the imposition of postgraduate fees, and he cancelled it because he was in fear of student protest. That meant he left the issue of postgraduate fees unresolved for another month until early September, allowing the campaign against him to keep building.
Now, obviously I'm going to ask you how things unfolded with the occupation. But just before I do that, can we take a step back and answer the question, why are occupations so important? We're not making this podcast about a protest or even about a student strike. We're making it about an occupation. And what we're saying is that really matters. So why are occupations such an important part of student struggle?
Well, look, student protests on campus can be disruptive for a day or even months on end, as we found out going through July and August and early September.
With the encampments, you mean?
With in 1994. The thing was announced in July, so August and September. They're protests for months on end, but similar to the encampment. Palestinian encampments, but those protests can affect the brand of the university. It's seen as a troublesome university, etc., etc. But the question of power at a university is posed by an occupation, especially the chancellery building. That's where the VC is. That's where admin is. That's where the university council meets. It poses the question: who rules the campus? Is it the VC in control or other students? And the question becomes sharply posed. And the students in occupation temporarily become an alternate body on campus that questions the right of the VC, the admin's legitimacy to make decisions about student lives.
Okay, so let's go back to September 1994. We've had, as you described, months of protests, strikes, lobbying, all sorts of activity. We get to the point of where I assume a majority of the activists are agreeing with an occupation. How did it unfold?
Well, on 7th of September, that is 2 days before the University Council was set to have a meeting on the fees, the No Fees campaign called the campus-wide strike. It had been months of these protests, so we got, right, we'll call a campus-wide strike, not just the law faculty. It turned into a massive stay-away strike with 80% of classes affected. General staff are unanimously resolved not to handle incoming postal mail, which is incredibly important in the pre-internet days. And then 2 days later, after this strike, legal workshop fees were set by the University Council, not at $9,000, the original $9,000, but at $5,000 just for legal workshop. There was an open day on a Saturday soon after in Melville Hall, and a small number of students held a brief occupation at this open day. And what I would call an abortive occupation, in the sense that we had practice of trying to stage an occupation, a dry run. And in that era, the National Union students would routinely call one-day protests and national days of actions, NDAs, about whatever issues students were affecting students. And an NDA had been called for Thursday the 15th. 2 days before the NDA, on the Tuesday, the No Fees campaign held its own protest rally over the fees with about 120 in what used to be called Union Court. It's now called Canberra. Via word of mouth, we told everyone that we were going into the chancellery on Thursday in 2 days' time, no matter what. And that meant 1 in 4 people who turned out on Thursday, there was a 400 strong protest, knew we were trying to get into chancellery that day, and they were ready. People had gone through the protests, the campus-wide strike. The university wasn't listening. We were going in. And the Thursday National Day of Action started at Canberra, and we marched to the Chancellery, and that had been a tradition. Every protest ended up at the Chancellery. There were no police there, and for some unknown reason, the first set of glass sliding doors at the Chancellery were left open, with a building and grounds official in the alcove, where the second set of glass doors were. Now, the problem was that only a small number of students could fit into this alcove where the second set of glass doors were locked. And the protest then started to turn back around and leave. And there's a real fear by us and the activists at the front that we weren't going to get in. So one student just started banging his fist on the second set of glass doors, and he was joined by a second student and a third. And so there's this massive, clanging and banging on the glass, and the security guard behind the second set of glass doors freaked out at the idea of the glass breaking and falling on them, that they opened the door with the key. And the students at the front immediately grabbed the key out of the wall lock, and the NDA proceeded to climb the stairs to the 4th floor of the Chancellery building. Tim Breedis did a MA thesis at the University of Sydney, and he's got a journal article in the Journal of Australian Studies in 2019, and it gives you an accurate description of the movement against the fees in the occupation. And Bridis interviewed several participants, and one of them said, "We hug, overwhelmed, hanging out the windows, feeling different, better." And another one says, "I lived and breathed the occupation."
So were all students on board with the struggle? You say 400 students protested and 100 were revved up to go in. Does that mean they were isolated on the campus, or was it the case that lots of students were sympathetic and rallied around the occupation once it started? Because to hold a building for 8 days, there are practical considerations, like food.
Well, look, we got in about 2 o'clock on the 15th, but in our excitement, we really didn't cement the idea that we're in for the long haul, or to hold a general meeting in the early evening to delegate the tasks necessary to run an occupation. The Student Association President Caitlin Wyndham and Socialist Alliance began talking about having a meeting to end the occupation. And that kind of stewed in this sort of vacuum till finally at midnight there was a meeting. I was there because it was after work, and those students argued, "Look, we've made our point, now it's time to leave." A few socialists got up to speak and reply, but there was a larger number of non-aligned students who spoke up against leaving and won the vote to stay. And from then on, I knew the occupation had real roots. And then, so we did then start to do the important work, the committee, like food, publicity, cleaning, childcare, people going home and getting their sleeping bags. And in the process of being seen as a serious occupation, we went out to get broader support, to tell other students that there was an occupation, and the word spread like wildfire. And people would come into the occupation and volunteer and do all the things. And there was an entertainment committee which put a band on one night, and a poetry reading and all that kind of thing.
What kind of support did the students get from workers? I can't remember off the top of my head when the National Tertiary Education Union became the National Tertiary Education Union, but clearly staff on campus would have been organised. You mentioned already that with the student strikes that postal workers respected the student picket lines. So was there support from the union movement for the occupation?
Well, look, ANU is a big employer in Canberra, and it was increasingly run like a corporation in 1994. So all the features you see of universities today, they were already beginning to happen in the early 90s. So admin at ANU stored up plenty of resentment from the unions when they were playing hardball in various enterprising bargaining negotiations. Because not only do you have the NTU, you have the general staff. You had the metalworkers branch in Canberra was the biggest branch was at ANU.
Yeah, there would have been maintenance workers.
Yeah, maintenance workers. So once students occupied, we actually got the support of the ACT Trades and Labour Council. Canberra's a smaller city, so the TLC came right in and endorsed any picket lines on the campus that unionised workers should respect, including, as I said, the postal delivery in the pre-internet days. Unionised public servants in departments like employment, education and training, which was the department implementing neoliberal policies, the workers there passed motions in support of the students. The occupation kept looking outward, and to involve more and more ANU students as well. The NTU, I don't know, or their precursor, didn't actually go on strike, but there was a lot of passive support for the students. Now, the VC for planning and admin, Philip Self, told the Canberra Times the protest was a blip that would soon pass. But he also let slip in the interview, protests have begun to cause serious concern and disruption to the university. And indeed, 3 days earlier, the Australian revealed the university is understood to be keen to resolve the dispute, especially since the students' picket lines were extended to include the mail centre, halting outgoing and incoming mail. So it wasn't just a case that we occupied the building. We then had picket lines, and disrupted the running of the university, and they were respected because the TLC had endorsed, the students' pickets.
Yeah, it's probably just worth reminding younger listeners how important mail was in those days. The internet was really only in its complete infancy. Most people didn't have email accounts, and universities were early adopters. So mail was incredibly important. Everything went through mail, and then there was an internal mail system within all big employers, particularly in universities. And I worked at RMIT up until 7 or 8 years ago, and there was still an internal mail service because there were documents that could not or should not be submitted to email. So just a reminder that when we talk about something that happened 30 years ago, that the scene was different. The struggle in many ways remains the same, but some of the technical issues change. So what happened? Did the students win? Did they win everything they wanted? And if they didn't win everything they wanted, what was the underlying problem?
Okay. For 8 days and 9 nights, the Chancellery was a festival of the oppressed. Like you said, it's a festival of resistance. And it created a common bond of struggle and a tradition because 400 people went in on the Thursday, but it was not the same 400 that lasted in the 8 days and nights. Other people came and went, and that tradition of a revival of the struggle meant that in August 1997, when Tyrrell proposed staff cuts, over 1,000 students protested outside the Chancellery to put demands on Dean Tyrrell to stop the cuts. But back in 1994, the student committee to negotiate with the VC was formed with the three student presidents, Student Association Caitlin Lyndon Coppin from the Law Student Society, and David Atkins from the Postgraduate and Research Association, and three independent or not aligned or socialists, and taking turns. Now those three presidents accepted the deal that Tyrrell offered on close to day 8. But an occupation mass meeting was held, and they didn't accept that deal.
And what was the deal?
I can't remember the full details, but there was some sort of minor concession. But they were still going to charge the $5,000 fees. But the crucial thing was that those three presidents accepted the minor compromise, walked away, and it left the occupation open to attack, which Tyrrell did immediately. On day 8, the Australian Federal Police were called, and they used chainsaws on the back wooden doors to get into the building. Oddly enough, the university billed the Students' Association the money for the damage to the Chancellery the next year in 1995. So the upfront fees had been, in the course of the campaign, had been reduced from the headline figure $9,000 to $5,000. And as Graham Hastings wrote of the ANU occupation, it rekindled the fees campaign across the country. And that fight went on for many campuses until 1998. A socialist and independent left ticket, led by one of the leading students of the occupation, was elected the Students' Association president in 94 in one of the highest turnouts for a student election in the 30 years. And so we kept fighting around the issues, even though we hadn't won. In terms of why we didn't get everything we wanted, students have power on campus to fight. That's true, but it's a limited kind of power. The ability to disrupt, the ability to create a political or governance crisis on campus is the power students have. But it's not enough. They don't have the economic and social power of organised workers to stop production. We won the support of campus workers, but those workers didn't actually go on strike in solidarity with the students. It's no one's fault. It just didn't happen at that time. And at the end of the day, the VC and could call the police in and break up the occupation, which is what Tyrrell ended up doing.
Okay, so 30 years on, we're talking about this occupation as if it matters, because it did. What are the lessons we can draw, that students can draw in particular, but all of us can draw from the experience of 30 years ago?
Well, the lessons I had to think, time to think about. I think the lessons for today are threefold. One, mass defiance can win concessions from the VC and admin. I mean, admin actually dropped the amount of legal workshop, and I can't remember if they actually started having postgraduate fees in other faculties. I think they were kind of like, they got such a rude shock that it might have been just limited to the law faculty for a few years before they tried it to spread it elsewhere. So mass defiance can win concessions from the VCs. Secondly, students can't just occupy and they think that the admin will cave. They have to continue to be building outwards, drawing more students in. They need the support of not only more students, but crucially workers on campus. And those workers need to take industrial action themselves in support of students, because if the admin wins over that the admin will be then taking on those campus workers. The third thing is the presence of a principled, non-sectarian socialist student club that has some size is crucial in winning many of the arguments which are necessary to win any fight on the campus. I think we had about maybe 8 or 10 students on campus. We had another 6 or 7 worker members in our Canberra branch, and the existence of a group of socialist students who are united around the power of mass action, but who can openly and democratically debate the strategy and tactics needed to win, that's really important. And once you have that allows you to make your own history.
Thanks, Tom. Absolutely fascinating.